Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Spencer Borison from the Codibly team. Excited to have you all on this webinar today. I'm happy to be joined by Jay Snyder from the CPower team, and I'll let him introduce himself in some more detail here in just a minute. So as we're going to get started here, I will be sharing my screen, and then we'll be jumping right into it in about 15 seconds. So bear with me here, and we're excited to have you. And I'll go through some housekeeping as we get started so everyone knows the lay of the land and how we're going to be taking some questions and engagement from you throughout this webinar. So why don't we dive right into it? So this is the Virtual Power Plants and Demand Response webinar. We're hoping to share some key lessons learned and some insights from real projects and recent developments in the market that both of our organizations have been actively working on. And just a quick agenda for you. So we'll do just a minute or two here, and then I'll introduce myself and also ask Jay, who's joining me as a fellow panelist, to introduce himself. Then Jay's going to present from the CPower perspective how they're seeing the market, some different facts and figures, and some interesting insights from CPower in terms of this market. And then I'll present something similar from Codibly's perspective, a little bit more on the technical side. And then we'll try to save as much time as we can towards the end of the hour together for Q&A and making sure that everyone who is joining us here live can ask their questions, and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible, depending on how much time we have left. And so in terms of asking questions, you will have joined from the LinkedIn link, I assume. If you could just make your comments directly on that LinkedIn event page, we'll be able to see those throughout the webinar. And while we likely won't stop in the middle of the presentations to answer them, we will make sure to reserve as much time as possible to answer those at the end. So without further ado, just a couple quick housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded, so the slides and the webinar recording will be available on our website. As I mentioned, please write your questions into the comments page within the LinkedIn section. And if there's additional questions that you have that you didn't get the chance to answer or to ask, and you want more information, you can email me directly. My email is here. It'll also be in the slides we send out, and we can coordinate a call with the right people to make sure that we can address any further questions or concerns that you have. So with that, maybe I'll start by having Jay, if you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll do the same.
Sure. Thank you so much, Spencer. Thank you for having me here today. So as the slide indicates, I'm the Manager of Field Integration and Technology Alliances at CPower. I've been a leader in the clean tech space for over 15 years and have been with CPower for the last 3.5 years, effectively seeking out partners such as Codibly that can help us, expand the reach and impact of the demand response programs that we support through enabling end-to-end automation for the customer's ease of use. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, nice to have you here, Jay. And for myself, I am the head of our US business here at Codibly. I'll spend a few more minutes later on in the presentation giving a bit more context for Codibly, but we're a team of about 1,500 developers and domain experts that do a lot of technical integration work and supporting clients across the VPP demand response grid services space to think about how they can better integrate with players like CPower and others across the market, and leveraging some of our custom accelerators to help accelerate some of those integrations as well. So I've been with Codibly for about 2 years and in the space for about 8. So excited to have this conversation. And I think without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jay, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And Jay, I'll let you take over control to run through your presentation.
Yep. Thank you so much. Can you see my slides?
Let's see. Yep, we can. Yep. So I think all good.
Great. Well, thank you again to Spencer and the Codibly team for having us here today. And thank you to all of you for showing up and showing an interest in what we have to say. So a bit about CPower, for those of you who may not know of us, we are the leading U.S. distributed energy resource monetization and virtual power plant provider. We're creating a customer-powered grid, distributed energy resource, or DER, is any asset that consumes, generates, or stores energy and can respond to a signal. A virtual power plant, or VPP, is an aggregation of DERs that provides grid services via a coordinated dispatch. Our portfolio, again, the largest within the US, represents 7 gigawatts of customer sited load at 27,000 sites. So, what is a virtual power plant? The DERs that make up our portfolio can be anything from behind the meter storage to HVAC curtailment at a box store to flexible computing load. CPower identifies the flexibilities, connects, pulls, and controls those assets, and finally sells that flexibility into energy markets across the US. Our marketing team has recently devised a very helpful analogy for those of you who may not be that well aware of demand response and understand why someone would be paid for using less power. This analogy involves airlines. At least here in the US, airlines sometimes overbook flights based on the premise that not everyone will show up. Sometimes, though, more passengers do show up than there are seats on the aircraft, and instead of adding a flight, which would be cost prohibitive, the airline opts to pay customers who are willing to time shift their flying to a later flight. In a similar way, the electric grid has a large buffer of generation that satisfies user needs far beyond average usage, but will become constrained in a handful of peak hours every year. Just like the airline, it's much more cost effective to pay participants to shift their loads outside that congested period, bringing down the demand to meet the supply available rather than building a whole new power plant. I won't spend too much time on this final overview slide because its themes will come up later in my presentation. I just want to note that demand response really had its roots in a relatively simple scheme of what are called capacity programs, which relate most closely to our previous air travel analogy. They provide relief at those few hours of peak usage. However, increasingly, grid operators are offering more complex yet higher revenue programs around ancillary services, which handle more unpredictable and short lived variances in the energy delivery system, as well as economic programs that allow customers and grids to hedge against high real time power prices. I hope this overview was helpful. Certainly happy to answer any questions about CPower when we get to the Q&A period. And I now want to transition into talking about the major trends that CPower sees in the industry and that make up a key piece of our corporate strategy. The first major trend, which has started getting attention in the American mainstream media, is that electricity demand is without a doubt growing. This is a departure from the last few decades of plateaued demand and is due to many factors, including electric vehicles, electrification of heating and other end uses, and AI data centers' thirst for energy. At the same time, we've seen increasing instability in the grid due to extreme weather and so-called black swan events like the COVID-19 pandemic. You see here a number of examples drawn from the US, where demand response was called on to save the day, but where the customer experience could have been even better had there been more demand response resources available to operators. Regulators have taken notice, and using ERCOT as a prime example, you see on this slide the mention of the major disruptive storm in the winter of 2021. ERCOT has increased program options and the revenue levels associated with them to attract more participants to help solve these problems. CPower continues to answer this call through our vigorous efforts to add to our portfolio, both through identifying additional opportunities for our existing customers and, of course, signing new customers. On the last slide, I mentioned the challenges posed by the growth of AI, but the energy system will also benefit from what AI can bring to it. And CPower is no stranger to this concept. Over the last couple of years, we have launched a machine learning powered optimization tool we call Enterwise. This allows customers to reap all the benefits of the emerging variety of programs available to them. This was why I explained the newer flavors of demand response, like ancillary and economic programs, a little while ago. And this optimization doesn't even stop with the variety of demand response programs available to data customers, since some customers who have utility tariffs with aggressive demand charges will benefit also from reducing their own peak usage or in addition to their system coincident peaks. In other words, the energy they're using when the grid hits its peak. Our optimization tool takes that into account as it schedules the customer's assets. And as you would anticipate with machine learning, this is not a static calculation. We are constantly improving, whether through automatically considering new data or tweaking our algorithms to account for new savings and earnings opportunities. I'll end with a couple of quick case studies. Metal Technologies has been an excellent industrial sector customer of ours who started with capacity programs and then through our Enterwise AI tool has added in a full slate of programs that offer the dual benefits of financial returns as well as support of their sustainability goals. Our customers come from all sectors of our built environment, so on a completely different end of the spectrum, we work with the Houston Independent School District in Texas. As with any publicly funded organization, capital budgets are lean, and as this slide attests, the school district has directly used the revenues they've generated from demand response to fund much needed equipment upgrades. A great win for the teachers, students, and communities of the Houston School District. It could take many more hours to talk about all of the excitement CPower sees in the markets we serve over the coming years, but this hopefully gives a high-level view of how increasing loads, increasing weather variability, and artificial intelligence as a mission accelerant are all top of mind for our company today and for the future. Thank you again for having me, and Spencer, I'll turn things back over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Jay. And I think that's a great setup for our presentation. So I will transition into that. And for those who've joined us a few minutes late here on the webinar, as I mentioned at the top of the call, if you do have questions after about 10 to 15 minutes of my presentation here, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So as you have questions within that LinkedIn event, you should be able to ask your questions directly there within the comments area. So I definitely encourage you to do so, and we'll be saving a lot of time at the end of this hour to answer all of your questions to the best of our abilities. So just wanted to plug that again, and without any other delay, I will get started here on my presentation. Okay, looks like it's working, so let's go. So a quick overview of Codibly. Hopefully, I can keep this very brief. So Codibly has been around for about 13 years. We've got a team of over 200 people internally to our organization and have recently joined forces with a company called Spirasoft, which is a larger organization. So have actually grown our geographical footprint to South America, North America, into different parts of Europe and Asia. So we have developers in many different regions now and a team of over 1,500 people. We've worked with a lot of different companies, both in the e-mobility space as well as the utility space and the broader OEM renewables space. So we've got a deep expertise within this type of project and work closely with aggregators like CPower and others to understand the trends and what's happening in demand response and the VPP space. So wanted to just double click a little bit in terms of some of the work that we do. So within renewable energy, we do a lot with different energy market integrations, whether that's directly to utilities through specific programs and communication protocols, or it's helping to integrate with aggregators, like some of the leaders in the market. And then we also do a lot with energy storage, so residential and commercial energy management systems. Basically, we lead all of the software for a lot of the projects that we do. So helping with monitoring, better commissioning processes, how do we bring in data, aggregate that data, and display it more effectively, and allowing customers to get more out of their assets and offer better services and capabilities to their customers. Um, and then within the e-mobility side of our business, we do a lot within the fleet charging, smart charging, demand response capability, and also building the charge point management systems and EV driver apps that are needed for customers and other players, charge point operators within the space to effectively engage within this emerging market. And then we also do a lot with exploring V2X and how this is going to impact being able to aggregate some of the power that's found within the batteries in these different electric vehicles as we increase the electrification of our system to be able to best leverage that to handle peak events, similar to what Jay had described in his presentation. So a quick transition then into how we're looking at this space at a high level. I think hopefully this helps with a bit of context. So of course you've got the utilities at the top, typically in the nomenclature of a lot of the major protocols for demand response. This would be the virtual top node, the VTN. And there's typically two ways that there's an architected solution between utilities and homes and businesses at the bottom. You can have a direct integration between the manufacturer of a residential or commercial system and that device and the utility through a protocol like OpenADR, or in some cases, something like an IEEE 2030.5 CSIP protocol directly through the utility. But in a lot of cases, there's increased value and ease of actually making that aggregation by relying on one of these leading aggregators, such as a CPower, to help you manage the load that you have and to be able to participate in those demand response incentives more effectively. So we also see this sort of acting as a virtual top node from the utility, and then the aggregator sort of sits as both a virtual end node and a virtual top node in the ecosystem here, and then connects with the home and business directly. So that would also be how we see it, and then we see ourselves sitting intimately nestled within these different pieces, helping with the actual integrations between those different parties, and especially from the home and business and the manufacturer of the devices for commercial and residential and industrial sites, integrating with those aggregators or integrating with those utilities and implementing the protocols necessary in the cases where that's relevant. So wanted to spend a few minutes here talking about the key benefits of virtual power plants as Codibly sees it. I won't spend too much time because I think Jay did a good overview of what we see in the market in terms of the benefits here. But just quickly here. So decentralization is the first one. Unlike traditional power plants that rely on centralized large-scale generation, VPPs are able to integrate multiple and many small-scale energy resources, reducing the single point of failure that you might have from a single power plant going down and allowing for greater grid resilience. Second, you've got cost effectiveness. So VPPs help utilities to defer expensive capital investments by leveraging existing capacity distributed across the grid. And that's increasingly important, especially as we see increasing demand and load across the system for some of the reasons that Jay mentioned around electrification and the growth in demand from data centers powering AI, to continue to be able to leverage the existing resources rather than have to make significant upfront capital investments with uncertainty in the future, is a big benefit to utilities and grid providers. Third is environmental impact. VPPs are often primarily utilizing renewable energy sources. So this allows for the leveraging of those renewable energy sources to be part of what provides the power to the grid on a daily basis. And so it reduces the greenhouse emissions and also reduces the need for what is often used in the traditional system for meeting peak demand, which are natural gas peaker plants, which are typically very polluting and inefficient. And the reason that they're used is that they can be ramped up and ramped down very quickly to meet those immediate demand shocks, but they're also very polluting. And so there is a much better way to do it that has a greater environmental impact through VPPs. Fourth, grid support. So VPPs provide ancillary services like frequency regulation, voltage control, and load balancing. And so they can help enhance the overall grid stability. And finally, scalability. CPower would be able to speak to this, and certainly that first chart that Jay showed, showing the expanse of what CPower is able to manage and how many gigawatts they have under their management. You can see that VPPs can be scaled, and so they can integrate many more DERs and orchestrate demand response. And just by connecting all these different devices, you're able to scale very quickly to meet the emerging and growing peak demand needs of different utilities. So I'd like to spend a minute here just talking about some of the core obstacles that we see to VPPs. So the first would be these wholesale market rules. So I think this is cut off, but it's a FERC order 2222, which is requiring that regional transmission organizations, RTOs, as well as independent system operators, ISOs, would allow for DERs to participate alongside traditional resources in the regional organized wholesale markets through aggregations by 2026. So on the surface, that's a great thing, and certainly it is. And that rule through the RTOs and ISOs would cover about 2/3 of communities across the United States. But it's really not that simple because the order is fairly vague and it allows RTOs to make their own rules. And so there's several factors that may impact how well VPPs are able to thrive in those markets in the future. One is actually the timing of the RTOs starting to implement that ruling. Another is that there's some vagueness around the eligibility thresholds for aggregations. There's some fairly significant metering and telemetry, more technical requirements, as well as interconnection process requirements. And then there's also some questions around customer data access. And so being able to navigate some of these different challenges and allow for DERs to participate more actively across that broad expanse of the United States will enable VPPs to leverage the door that's been opened by this FERC order 2222, and hopefully that will allow VPPs not to have this obstacle. Second is retail utility offerings. The truth is that unfortunately many areas do not have any retail programs at the moment, and many that do are not necessarily very attractive from a financial incentive perspective, so they're not bringing in a lot of customers to want to participate actively. So there's some utility operators that do not trust VPPs to deliver critical services when called upon. The necessary infrastructure in some cases, smart meters and other software systems are not yet in place in a lot of these different programs. Utilities are often required to provide technology-specific programs for EV chargers, smart thermostats, and battery storage. So each would have, in a lot of cases, its own specific program for each of those different device types, rather than offering a single comprehensive program, which makes it a little bit more challenging for customers to navigate and for customers to be interested in using it because it requires more upfront investment and investigation to figure out how to connect all those different pieces to different sub-programs within the utility. And then also just the way that utilities work. Utilities are financially incentivized to make capital investments and not so much to promote demand-side solutions. So they can pass along those capital investments through rate increases. And so there's a lot of incentive sometimes for utilities through their traditional financial model to try to build that extra capacity rather than rely on existing resources. So it's a bit of an incentive game. And I think also there's some cases where legacy resource planning models are not adequately considering how much demand response resources can participate and provide optionality and additional capacity to the grid. So that's sort of a conglomeration of different thoughts there in terms of utility retail offerings. Certainly they are continuing to grow and we are seeing some hopeful signs, but there are some obstacles there that sit in the way. And then the third one here is consumer and policymaker awareness. So I think as a lot of folks on this call would probably be slight exceptions because you're more actively engaged in the space for the most part. But for the average consumer or policymaker, there's not a high awareness of exactly what VPPs are or what demand response is and how they can best benefit from either creating legislation to promote that from a policymaker perspective or for consumers to take advantage of that when they're thinking about their home ecosystem, or in the case of commercial and industrial customers, thinking about how they can participate in demand response consumption patterns. So there comes a case then because of that virtual power plant providers like a CPower, I'm sure can attest to it as well, need to spend significant time and investment of resources just on the education piece about the benefits of the programs, what this means for customers, how customers can best utilize it. It's not always clear cut and easy for customers to do on their own, so it adds cost to the overall customer acquisition process. And similarly, this would apply to policymakers as well. There's a large need from a policy perspective to advocate for the value of these different things. And I think with some of these harsh weather events that Jay talked about in one of his slides, you're definitely seeing more interest in different alternative solutions. But certainly, there's still a lot that can be learned and some more awareness that can be brought that presents an obstacle to widespread adoption of VPP technology. So now I want to turn to, from Codibly's perspective, some of the work that we've done recently. I've got a few technical lessons learned and takeaways that I want to elaborate on a little bit here based on some conversations that we've had with clients, as well as within my internal technical team who have led a lot of the integrations for these types of projects. So I had 4 that I wanted to call out here, and definitely happy to double click on these in the Q&A, and also if there's interest in any of the specific technical capabilities here, we can certainly have a follow-up conversation offline. So the first is security. So establishing a secure connection between the virtual top node and the virtual end node, which in that original diagram I showed can be sort of the utility or the consumer as the end node. It's complex, and it involves configuring manual TLS with OpenADR specific certificates. It's important to allocate time and resources to infrastructure configuration so it does not become a blocker for the project's progress. So basically, there's a lot of thinking here that is required and a lot of expertise that's needed to understand how to make that secure connection so that things are secure and that the privacy of customer data and the configuration of the infrastructure is so that it will work effectively to pass communication between those two different nodes, or in some cases between the utility, the aggregator, and the end consumer. Second is integration. So choosing between push and pull integration models requires careful consideration of system requirements and capabilities. Both integration topologies are possible in this type of integration, but they offer different trade-offs. So I wanted to quickly talk about that. So the push model, basically, it's the approach that enables the VTN, so the utility or the aggregator, to push information to the VEN, the customer or the device. It's suitable for scenarios requiring real-time data and immediate response. And so it can be very effective at being able to transfer that real-time data and be able to get a very immediate response. However, it's much more complex to implement, and it's more difficult to maintain due to the need for continuous connection and data flow. So the push model has great capabilities, but also significant investment costs and monitoring and maintenance costs. On the other side, you've got the pull model. In this model, the virtual end node, so the customer side, would periodically pull information from the virtual top node. This method is simpler and it's often more reliable in environments with intermittent connectivity. However, it also can have delays in data transmission and response times. So it really depends on what your specific use cases are. If you need real-time 24/7 instantaneous support, then the push model is probably better, but that also comes with the trade-off of it being more difficult to configure and implement. And therefore, depending on what your use case is, the pull model may also be more effective because it's easier to establish. Third, the modularity. So splitting the architecture and related tasks into specific modules, such as telemetry gathering, such as reporting, such as device enrollment, and such as demand response event handling, is easier for the team to implement if you split it into different modules. Each module also requires specific expertise in their respective context and technology stack. And so trying to do everything in one go rather than splitting it into modules is going to cause issues both from a technical perspective and also probably will cause delays. So think about splitting the architecture into different modules to be able to be more efficient and to operate more in an agile framework. And finally, communication. So this is probably one that's clear across anyone that's done sort of a implementation of any type of software or really any team project. But being able to establish communication channels via Slack or other messaging services and conducting efficient and timely and regular meetings, especially in the beginning of a project, is crucial. Typically, Codibly prefers to have a workshop, a team on the client side for 1-2 days, and help align the team both in terms of some of the things like vocabulary and what we're talking about to make sure everyone's aligned around the objectives, but also then to dive into the technical requirements and how we're going to collaborate on a day-to-day time frame to make sure that everything's working appropriately. So fostering that collaborative environment from the beginning with the client and with the implementation team, and also having alignment meetings throughout, will ensure that there's mutual understanding and that resolution of issues can happen quickly and that the project can be delivered in an efficient manner. So those are some of our key takeaways. I'm looking at the time, and I know that we want to leave 25 minutes for questions. So I think I'm actually going to just talk about one case study that we have here rather than diving into both. I can certainly, these slides are available. So if you are interested in the other case study, we'll definitely have time and be able to share that. But want to make sure that we've got time for Q&A. So our case study here is an aggregator integration. So the client that we were working with and actually just wrapped up this project last month is one of the leading OEMs for inverters and batteries. And they wanted to provide its customers with the possibility of engaging in demand response programs facilitated by Energy Hub in this case. Although Energy Hub is just one example of many of the different aggregators, but this one was specifically for programs that they offered. This requires that the client would create an integration software that would automate DER behavior in time for demand response events, and it would also be able to collect necessary telemetry for reporting. Now, those who are on the call who have worked with some of the aggregators, the integration time can be pretty significant, and it can certainly be a significant effort from the technical perspective. That certainly varies by different aggregator, but in Energy Hub's case, it's fairly significant, and time can be between 4 and 8 months for a full integration with their software and the ability to actively participate in all of the different programs that they have access to. And so there was a significant effort to try to expedite that. So the major areas of work that we did, one was an API contract, so defining and discussing integration APIs with other services in the client's cloud environment. The role of the integration service is to provide a translation layer between the two different APIs with minimal overhead. Second, we were looking at the domain understanding. So being able to understand the client's requirements, like how they wanted to be able to do pre-charging behavior of batteries before the start time of the DER event to maximize the energy delivered during the event, was incredibly crucial here to make sure that we could adapt the solution to their needs. And then also being able to leverage an accelerator that Codibly offers for integrating with Energy Hub, because that is already a pre-built code base. But with that licensing and implementation of the code base, each client's unique infrastructure requires some amount of customization and making sure that it is compatible with the different databases and components they have within the infrastructure. So a couple quick things that we learned, and then, like I promised, we'll go right into Q&A after that. First is that, like I said before, efficient communication paths is crucial. So we, in this case, held daily updates. So just a quick check-in with the teams, both on the Energy Hub side and the client side, to make sure that we could talk through anything that was needed, any risks, any tasks that needed to be supported by someone else on the team. And that allowed us to be flexible and also to be aligned around the same vision for executing this project efficiently. We were also able to, and would suggest being able to quickly adjust priorities and methodologies in response to unforeseen issues. The flexibility in this project, where it had tight deadlines and many dependencies, has many different players, and sort of an evolving set of requirements, made it that we had to be able to adapt to different things that happened mid-project to be able to be successful here. And also we were able to leverage OpenADRs and Mercury Edge APIs modular nature. So like I mentioned in one of the technical implementation lessons, being able to have these different modules, so for enrollments, events, opt-ins and opt-outs and reports, can significantly enhance the ability to efficiently work and deliver this integration. So those are some of the lessons learned from this one. Like I mentioned, we have another case study in the slide deck, which I'm going to pause and not get to now, because I do want to go to the question and answer section of this event. So I will stop sharing my slides here in just a moment, and would encourage those who've joined us who have questions, both of myself and of Jay, to please continue asking your questions within the LinkedIn page for this event. We'd be happy to take them now. So I will share and then go to that now. All right. So I am just going to okay. And I'm going to ask my team just to make sure that I'm looking at the right area. So I'm looking at a couple here, and I think right now we've just got a few. So definitely encourage folks to ask. So Jay, maybe this is a question for you. We've got a question that asks sort of what are some of the key programs across the country that you guys are keeping an eye on in terms of emerging potential demand response programs at different utilities specifically that are starting to be talked about or that are new to the market, and sort of where you see some of the new opportunities in terms of states across the country that may not have necessarily capitalized on those programs already and have robust programs at this point.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And that is one area, I guess, that I didn't focus on as much in my presentation was the specific programs that we see emerging with these trends. A real area of excitement, which ties back, actually, Spencer, to your call out of FERC 2222, which is a great call out. It's certainly a major piece of policy for our industry. The New York ISO has kind of issued their first, response, or I guess actually implemented their first response, I should say, to 2222, which they call the DER participation model. It's kind of an overarching program that has a few different modes of participation and kind of supersedes a couple prior programs that the NISO was running. CPower is pretty excited. We're first to market in national grid territory for being able to enroll customers into that program. And we're excited now to see it roll out into other utility territories within NISO. So I would say that one has definitely been top of mind for me and many others at CPower, as it's kind of given us a taste of one RTO's interpretation of 2222. The other area I would have to mention, and then I'll stop my answer after this, is the Mid-Continent ISO, or MISO as it's called. This is a geographically pretty large and disparate part of America, kind of starting from Michigan, parts of Indiana, Missouri, but then also down south to the parts of the Gulf Coast. Kind of, again, that whole mid-continent area had previously been an area of the country that, first of all, kind of had some of that skepticism, Spencer, that you alluded to with VPPs, and also was pretty walled off to aggregators. And again, a theme you touched on, this stuff is complicated. A lot of customers don't necessarily know how to do it. So without really inviting aggregators to the table, there was a lot of lost opportunity there. Well, a couple years ago, that started to shift. And CPower is now active in a couple of states within that territory, notably Michigan and Missouri. And we are absolutely continuing to keep a very close watch on developing opportunities elsewhere within that region. So I would say that's really kind of at the frontier, given how it's only recently really started to provide the level of opportunity that we've seen throughout, other parts of the country that are, managed by wholesale markets.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And maybe one thing that I'll add, just taking it a slightly different direction, is we're also seeing, so we work with a lot of companies that not only do, battery storage and work within that space, but also a lot that do smart devices. So HVACs, water heaters, heat pumps, players in this space. And there's been some requirements in two states, so Washington State and Oregon on the Pacific Northwest, for having to meet a certain demand response communication protocol. It's associated with OpenADR and the EcoPort CTA 2045 standard. Can certainly talk about that and have other webinars on that, so I don't want to go too far into that. But basically, they have been in a requirement for any new HVAC or water heater to be compliant with that, to be able to sell in the state of those two states. And then we're also seeing that there's a lot of interest right now and a lot of speculation that California may also mandate that as a requirement in the near future in 2025. And so we've been talking to a lot of customers who are starting to wonder whether implementing one of these standards makes sense for them, given the fact that California is one of the, really the flagship states for a lot of these customers that are thinking about selling, or a lot of our clients that are thinking about selling to customers across the United States for demand response. So being able to potentially be required in California to sell those types of devices, to have that type of smart communication protocol implementation is really critical. So definitely something to keep an eye on. And I guess that's all I'll add there. So second question, I'm actually seeing it's around protocols. So sort of touched into what I was just mentioning, and they're asking about the 3.0 standard for OpenADR. I guess I'll say that I did a webinar about 6 weeks back with Rolf Bennert, the head of the OpenADR Alliance, talking about this ecosystem. So definitely don't want to spend too much time on it here, because I know that that's not necessarily directly what we were hoping to talk about, and I want to make sure we can continue to pick Jay's brain on some other topics. But I'll say that 3.0 is an emerging standard. 2.0b, which was the previous standard for OpenADR, is still active and is still the one that we're seeing most customers implement right now in the market. But we're also seeing that 3.0 is starting to be adopted, or at least explored, by some of the more progressive utilities in California and parts of the Northeast. But with that, we've been told by the Alliance that if you have an implementation of 2.0b, all of the programs currently being explored by these different utilities and regions are grandfathering in that standard as part of the new programs they're developing with 3.0. So I guess I would say certainly look into 3.0. There's some different use cases and ease of implementation that makes it more attractive. But if you've already gone down the path of 2.0b, don't worry, because I think you'll be all right. So that's all I'll say there. And again, just a shameless plug to check out our other webinars if you're interested in that topic. And one other question I'm seeing from the Q&A is, and Jay, I think this one would probably be for you, is a question about how CPower and the business model varies from folks like a Leap or an Energy Hub or AutoGrid, and sort of like, is CPower a peer of those organizations, or is it really serving a different market? And how do you guys think about the positioning of some of these different aggregators and some of the big brands that we hear in this space?
It is a common question, because I'll admit, if you're looking at it from the outside, it's a fairly complex, maybe to some degree kind of convoluted industry. So I would say, given the two names that were mentioned, Leap is probably the model that we're more similar to. AutoGrid, very familiar with them. Operate is more of a software provider to the utilities and other program operators to allow them to administer their demand response program. That's not really the primary mode that CPower is in. We're first and foremost a service company, a highly technology-enabled service company, but still a service company, where the service that we see ourselves providing to the market is offering that wholesale market access, as well as utility program enrollment services too, where that aligns to our customers, to our commercial and industrial customers spread out across the country. Leap is a fairly similar model. Leap, to my understanding, is more focused kind of specifically on batteries and getting those into the market. That is absolutely an area of extreme importance and strategic focus to CPower. But it's one part of what we do. We got our start where demand response was just curtailment, and batteries were just something you put into your remote control, a couple decades ago. So I mean, again, batteries, we embrace them, but we also focus on the traditional modes of curtailment to achieve demand response.
Great. Yeah, that's helpful. And I saw one other question just came in the LinkedIn, and this one's talking about, and Jay, I think maybe we can share this one a little bit. This one is about the differences in VPP between the European and U.S. markets. I'm happy to start a little bit there, and would be curious your thoughts to the extent you have them on the European market. So we're seeing, I mean, a lot of the same trends exist across the United States and Europe. I don't want to say that they're so substantially different. There's certainly climate change driven events that are making the need for demand response and virtual power plants that happen in the United States also happening in Europe. So there is definitely increased concern and conversation around the value of these assets. Some of the things that I think are interesting. So the UK has this Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. I think it's DESNIS. It's not a good acronym, but you can take a look at it. They've got a couple different standards that are being recognized for being able to have compliant devices sold into the markets for demand response. So they've got these two standards, PAS 1878 and 1879. So definitely would encourage you to check those out. We're also seeing that some of the countries in Europe are also looking to the US in terms of some of the energy efficiency standards that we have. So as I'm sure a lot of our listeners know, the United States has the Energy Star certification program through the Department of Energy. There are a lot of other countries that have similar requirements and different programs that have similar natured standards, both across Europe and across different parts of the world that leverage the same Energy Star certification requirements. So typically by achieving certification with Energy Star or similar standards in the United States, you're also able to have the same recognition or similar types of recognition and value across different markets in Europe. And then one other thing that I would mention is that standards like OpenADR I think are further along with adoption, and certainly the need for demand response is higher in some of the European markets. If you look at some of the countries, places like Norway, for instance, just standing out in the top of my head, has incredibly high EV penetration. And so there's an increased electrification of those economies. So the need and also the potential then of demand response and being able to orchestrate all of the spare capacity of these different devices causes there to be great opportunities. And I hope that that will continue to become the case in the United States as we continue to electrify our economy. But right now, Europe is ahead of the game in terms of EV penetration and other types of electrification efforts. So I think it would be unfair to say that we're in the same place, but certainly states like California might be able to give them a fairer comparison. But Jay, I would be curious if you have any other thoughts to add here.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I have to give the caveat up front that CPower is focused solely on the US, so I'm not an expert on the European markets. I guess, though, what I would say, from the limited knowledge I have, is that similar to the US, where there is anyone who's kind of worked with US energy markets knows there's not a US market. There's all these different regions that do things in very different ways from each other. My sort of understanding is that Europe is similar in that way, and in their case, made up of each country kind of doing their own thing. So on one kind of extreme, which I know was a surprise to me, last year I had an opportunity to talk to a company in France in the VPP space, and they actually told me that they felt that France was really behind in terms of demand response, and they were kind of curious to learn more about the US, programs. On the opposite end, Spencer, you referenced Norway. And I know I've learned from some of the partners that we work with that in the Scandinavian countries, they have a number of really sort of rapid response programs, more of the ancillary services variety that I talked about, that are actually mandated by tariff for some of their customers. So especially I've seen it with data center vendors, because there's also a lot of data centers up in that part of the world just due to the cool climate, that they've done this incredibly sophisticated fast response stuff that really is, you kind of referred to this a little bit, Spencer. There's definitely learnings that can occur when we kind of do look out and see what various countries are doing. And I think there's a lot to sort of transfer from experience of how to meet those, very stringent requirements in Scandinavia to the, more sort of nascent, fast acting programs in the US. And then I'll just end with, you started to touch on one area within the UK, Spencer, but one thing that I find really interesting, Octopus Energy, who's an interesting company in that they've started to, kind of approach the U.S. market, in a somewhat similar model, to what CPower is doing. But they've been for anyone who's followed them, and if not, I recommend looking into what they're doing in the UK specifically. They've been able to do very interesting kind of programs that they've sort of implemented, given the sort of vast latitude that energy retailers are given within the UK market. And certainly you can look at markets like Texas in the U.S. That have a pretty, free form, retail construct. But at least from what I see, it still doesn't even touch, what Octopus has been able to innovate, just given the policy framework there. So I think that's a really interesting place to look, and is probably pretty far ahead of almost anywhere else, just given the nature of what they've been allowed to do there.
Yeah, no, super interesting, and definitely interested to see and to hear some of the discussions in the upcoming conferences. I know we'll be at RE Plus in September, and also at NLIT in Milan in October, and I think those are also great opportunities that we've thought were very good ways to hear what's happening in the market, and to see the differences between these markets. And certainly there are some, but a lot of commonalities as well. I guess I'm going to stop us here because I don't see any other questions coming in. So I'll go to my closing slide here, and more than anything, just want to thank Jay and the CPower team for joining us today on this webinar. I think it's been a great discussion, and for those that participated and asked some of the questions, we appreciate your engagement, and certainly happy to follow up. And like I mentioned, the recording and the slides will be available on Codibly's website in the next few days, and certainly reach out to myself or to the CPower team if you'd like to have a further conversation, and we'd be happy to discuss what you're working on. So thank you for your time, and thanks, Jay, again for yours, and great discussion with you today. And I hope everyone has a nice rest of the week, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.